You're standing in a corridor you're not supposed to see. The stone is cold. The air smells of damp wool and something faintly metallic, fear, maybe, or blood that's been scrubbed away but never truly disappeared. Through a door that shouldn't be locked, you hear sobbing. Not the dignified weeping of a noble woman taught to grieve in silence, but the raw, animal sounds of someone whose world has shattered beyond repair. She's 15 years old. She's carrying a child. And the man who did this to her, the man everyone trusts, everyone admires, is about to walk away free. Before we go any further, I'd be genuinely curious to know where in the world are you watching this from? It's still astonishing to me that a story buried for centuries under lies and stone can somehow find its way to you. Wherever you are, right now. The year was 1456. The kingdom historians now believe it was likely the Portuguese court. Though records were so thoroughly destroyed that certainty remains elusive, was balanced on a knife's edge. Enemies surrounded the borders. Religious factions simmered with resentment. The royal family's grip on power depended entirely on one thing: the appearance of divine favor. Moral purity, unshakable legitimacy. A single scandal could reignite civil war. A whisper of impropriety could invite foreign invasion. Princess Eleonora was born into this world in 1441, the daughter of a king who ruled through calculated cruelty and a queen who had learned that survival meant choosing power over love. Always. Eleonora wasn't raised to be happy. She was raised to be useful, a living chess piece in the endless game of European alliances. Her worth measured entirely by her ability to secure a politically advantageous marriage and produce legitimate heirs. She learned languages, music, courtly etiquette. She learned how to smile through discomfort. She learned, above all, never to question the men who controlled her fate. But there was one man who seemed different. The Duke of Beaver, her mother's own brother, had built a reputation as a paragon of honor. A decorated military commander. A scholar. A man so devoted to duty that he'd never married. Claiming his service to the crown left no room for personal happiness. Courtiers whispered that he was the noblest man in the kingdom, the one person whose integrity could never be questioned. He began spending time with Eleonora when she was 7 years old. At first, it seemed innocent. He brought her books from distant lands, taught her Greek philosophy and Latin poetry. Encouraged her intellectual curiosity in ways the rigid court never would. While her parents obsessed over matters of state, her uncle filled the void, patient, attentive, endlessly interested in her thoughts and feelings. He made her feel special, seen, understood in a world that treated her as nothing more than a future womb for some foreign prince's dynasty. The lessons were always private. He insisted on it. The other tutors were too conventional, he said. Her ladies-in-waiting wouldn't understand the advanced subjects they were studying. These sessions needed to happen away from prying eyes, in chambers where they could focus without interruption. Eleonora starved for meaningful attention, never questioned why. The gifts began to change when she turned 12. Silk undergarments from the markets of Constantinople. Perfumes he would apply himself, his fingers lingering on her wrists, her throat. Books of poetry with certain passages marked verses about forbidden love, about connections that transcended ordinary morality. When she expressed confusion, discomfort, he would look wounded. Didn't she trust him? Didn't she understand how rare their bond was? Other girls her age were simpering fools, but she was exceptional, special. These gifts were simply reflections of that truth. Psychological manipulation, modern experts now recognize, follows predictable patterns. Isolate the victim. Create dependency. Establish yourself as the sole source of validation and understanding. Alternate between affection and withdrawal to keep them off balance, desperate for your approval. Construct elaborate justifications that make the abuse seem like privilege, enlightenment, even love. The Duke was a master of the craft. By the time Eleonora turned 14, He had systematically destroyed every relationship that might have offered her protection. Her ladies-in-waiting, jealous of her beauty and intelligence, he said they couldn't be trusted. The young nobles who might have courted her, crude simpletons, unworthy of someone with her refined sensibilities. Even her parents were framed as obstacles to her true potential, too consumed with politics to recognize the extraordinary person she was becoming. She was utterly alone, and he made sure she believed that isolation was actually freedom. The Duke's knowledge of the palace's hidden architecture, gained through years of military planning, allowed him to move through the corridors unseen. He knew which passages the guards ignored, which staircases led to forgotten wings, exactly when religious services would empty entire sections of the building. The abuse, when it began, happened in spaces that existed on no official map, attended by no witnesses, at times when the rest of the court was carefully occupied elsewhere. He framed it as education, initiation into adult understanding, proof of her sophistication. When she tried to resist, he became cold, distant, punishing her with the withdrawal of affection until she would apologize, beg him to forgive her childish hesitation. The cycle repeated until resistance became impossible, until her sense of reality had been so thoroughly warped that she no longer trusted her own instincts about what was happening to her. And then, in the autumn of 1456, the inevitable occurred. Eleonora began showing signs of pregnancy. She was 15 years old, unmarried, and carrying the child of her own uncle, a crime that combined incest, rape, and the destruction of everything the royal family had built their legitimacy upon. The timing could not have been worse. Marriage negotiations with 3 separate kingdoms were in delicate final stages, each dependent entirely on Eleonora's perceived virtue and availability. The discovery sent shockwaves through the inner circle, though those tremors were contained with ruthless efficiency. Court physicians were summoned under cover of darkness and sworn to silence under penalty of death. Their examination confirmed what the Queen had desperately hoped was merely illness. The girl was approximately 4 months along. There would be no hiding this much longer. When Eleonora finally found the courage to name her uncle as the father, she expected justice. Surely, she thought, the physical evidence would force them to act. Surely her parents would protect her now that the truth was undeniable. She didn't understand the mathematics of power. The emergency council that convened in the dead of night included the king, the queen, 3 trusted advisors who had proven their ability to bury inconvenient truths, and with breathtaking audacity, the Duke of Beaver himself. He sat in that candlelit chamber, accused of raping his teenage niece, and calmly negotiated the terms of his own protection. He reminded them of his military connections, his knowledge of state secrets that would prove devastating in enemy hands, his political influence among nobility who might withdraw their support if he were publicly disgraced. He held all the leverage. They held a pregnant 15-year-old girl whose existence had just become a catastrophic liability. The solution they crafted was as elegant as it was monstrous. The Duke would accept a prestigious diplomatic posting to a distant Eastern court reward for his years of loyal service. Meanwhile, Eleonora would disappear entirely, her absence explained by a mysterious wasting disease that required complete isolation and treatment by the kingdom's finest physicians. Public prayer services were organized for her recovery. The royal family made tearful displays of concern, so convincing that even courtiers who suspected darker truths chose to accept the comfortable lie rather than risk their positions by asking questions. While this elaborate fiction played out in public, Eleonora was moved to an abandoned wing of the palace rooms that had been sealed for decades, chosen specifically for their isolation. The windows were bricked over. The doors were reinforced and guarded. She would spend the rest of her pregnancy in a tomb for the living, attended only by servants who had been carefully selected for their loyalty and thoroughly intimidated into silence. The months that followed were designed to break her spirit before the child could be born. The servants were forbidden from speaking beyond the bare minimum necessary for her physical care. Books, writing materials, any form of intellectual stimulation denied. The only visitor was a priest who came weekly to hear confession, though he'd been instructed to report everything she said directly to the king. Her attempts to seek spiritual comfort were met with lectures about accepting God's will and maintaining family honor above personal suffering. The rooms were kept deliberately harsh freezing in winter, stifling in summer. Her diet was reduced to basic gruel and bread, supposedly for the baby's health, but actually to break her through systematic deprivation. The beautiful gowns and jewels that had marked her status were replaced with rough peasant wool. Every aspect of her former identity was methodically stripped away, replaced with crushing anonymity that served a single purpose, reminding her that Princess Eleonora no longer existed as anything more than a problem awaiting a permanent solution. Deprived of human contact and intellectual engagement, she began retreating into herself. Servants reported hearing her singing lullabies to her unborn child in the middle of the night, the only maternal tenderness permitted in her prison. Other times, they heard screaming. Eleonora naming her uncle's crimes in excruciating detail to an audience of stone walls and shadows. Her voice echoing through chambers that would never carry her accusations beyond their sealed boundaries. Meanwhile, the Duke had settled comfortably into his new diplomatic position. His reports back to the kingdom were praised for their brilliance. His negotiations proceeded smoothly. He even took a young wife from a noble family of his host country, finally providing himself with the cover of respectability he'd previously lacked. When news of Princess Eleonora's supposed illness reached him, he sent an appropriately sorrowful letter praising her virtues and lamenting the kingdom's loss. This letter was carefully preserved in official archives, another layer in the elaborate fiction, protecting him from consequences. The birth unfolded like a scene from the deepest circle of hell. On a bitter February night in 1457, after nearly 20 hours of brutal labor, Eleonora delivered a healthy boy for one brief, precious moment. She was allowed to see him, to touch his tiny hand before he was wrapped in coarse cloth and taken from her arms forever. Her screams filled the chamber, but they fell on ears that had been hardened by royal gold and threats of execution. The infant disappeared into the night. Some accounts suggest he was taken to a remote monastery where bastard children of nobility were raised as future monks. Others whisper of darker fates considered more permanent solutions to the problem he represented. With the immediate crisis resolved, the royal family faced a new question: what to do with Eleonora long-term? Some advisors suggested allowing her to take religious vows and live out her days in a convent. Others feared that even behind convent walls she might find ways to tell her story. The king, perhaps consumed by shame at his own failure to protect his daughter, chose the most merciless option available. Eleonora would remain in her palace prison indefinitely, a living ghost whose existence would be systematically erased from all official records. To the outside world, Princess Eleonora was already dead, having succumbed to her mysterious illness. An elaborate funeral was staged, complete with an empty coffin and a period of official mourning that fooled even foreign diplomats. The erasure of her identity was executed with chilling precision. Every portrait was removed from palace galleries and destroyed. One family painting was literally altered to remove her image, leaving an unexplained gap that observant courtiers learned never to question. Official genealogies were rewritten. Court scribes worked through countless nights creating new versions of documents. Her childhood possessions were gathered and burned. Within months, it was as if she had never existed at all. But Eleonora refused to disappear completely. Using a needle pulled from her clothing, she began carving words into the stone walls of her chamber, a process that took months and left her fingers bloody and scarred. She created an elaborate calendar system, marking each day since her child had been taken. She hid messages in the seams of her clothing and beneath loose floorboards, desperate attempts to leave some record for future generations who might uncover the truth. Using charcoal from the fireplace mixed with her own blood when necessary, she wrote on scraps of fabric torn from her bedding. In these hidden writings, she poured out not just accounts of her abuse and imprisonment, but poetry of heartbreaking beauty. Philosophical musings on power and justice, and desperate letters to the son she would never see again. One entry, carved deep into stone and dated approximately 3 years after the birth, simply read, "Today, I forgot the color of his eyes. I am losing him again, piece by piece, memory by memory." Years passed. Eleonora's mental state deteriorated under the weight of isolation and trauma. She developed elaborate delusions about her son's eventual return to rescue her. Preparing for his arrival each morning only to collapse in renewed despair each evening when he failed to appear. She became convinced the servants were spies sent by her uncle, leading to violent episodes that resulted in her being physically restrained for days at a time. Her physical decline matched the psychological destruction. By age 25, servants reported she appeared decades older, hair completely gray, face lined with premature wrinkles carved by anguish. Her body became frail from malnutrition and the constant dampness of her chambers. Yet, even in this deteriorated state, moments of terrible clarity would pierce through the fog. During these lucid periods, she would rage with an eloquence that reminded listeners of the intelligent princess she had once been, reciting passages from classical literature and twisting them into devastating indictments of her uncle's crimes and everyone who had enabled them. The final years brought an eerie calm that unsettled her guards more than her previous violence. She stopped attempting escape, ceased raging against captivity, abandoned preparations for her son's imagined return. After 15 years of imprisonment, Eleonora had simply exhausted her capacity for both hope and despair. She existed in a state beyond normal emotional categories, neither peaceful nor tormented, just breathing and moving through the motions of life while the essential spark that made her human had been systematically extinguished. She was found dead at 28, officially peacefully asleep, but the servant who discovered her described overturned furniture, scratches, and signs of a desperate fight. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, rooms hastily renovated to erase the messages she'd carved, though many hiding places were missed. Centuries later, those traces exposed the truth. The Duke of Beaver returned to court, honored and unchallenged, his crimes buried as he built a false legacy of virtue. The Queen died years later, haunted by nightmares. Her final whispered words, "The stones remember everything," hinting she knew her daughter's truth had survived. The fragments of Eleonora's testimony eventually surfaced. In the 19th century, during palace renovations, workers discovered the hidden writings. Historians spent decades piecing together the truth from carved stone, fabric scraps, and deathbed confessions from servants who could no longer bear the weight of their silence. The story they uncovered was one of the most damning indictments of unchecked power ever recorded. A 15-year-old girl, victimized by the man who should have protected her, then sacrificed on the altar of political expediency by everyone who claimed to love her. They succeeded in erasing her from official records. They buried her in an unmarked grave. They plastered over her words and burned her possessions and rewrote history itself to pretend she had never existed. But the stones remembered. And eventually, after centuries of silence, they spoke. Eleonora carved her truth into walls that would outlast kingdoms. She hid her words in places her captors were too arrogant to search thoroughly. She refused, even in madness and despair, to let them make her disappear completely. And because she fought to leave even the smallest trace of her existence, we know her name. We know what was done to her. We know the price of a system that valued reputation over justice, dynasty over human dignity, power over truth. Her son's fate remains unknown. Her grave has never been found. But her voice, desperate, furious, heartbroken, and achingly human, echoes still from those carved stone walls, a testament to the fact that some truths are too terrible to remain buried forever.